thank you for coming to the 21st D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture. Before we begin, I would request you to please switch off your mobile phones. And we'll begin today's lecture by requesting Mr. Suhas Borker, my dad, to please present the Angvastram to our honored speakers. Yes, I am also coming now. My younger sister is in the US and my mom's with her. She's been blessed with a daughter. So being a small family, it's just my dad and me today. So, it's like we are playing all parts. I would now request the two students from Bluebells, first Dabasmita Mukherjee for the invocation of the Bhagavad Gita, followed by Khushi Bose.
Good evening. Karmanyavadhikaraste ma bhareshu kadachana. Karmanyavadhikaraste ma bhareshu kadachana. Ma karma phala heturbhu ma te sango asattva karmani. Ma karma phala heturbhu ma te sango asattva karmani. Asattva karmani. Asattva karmani. You're right to work only, but never to the fruit thereof. Let not the fruit of your action be your object, nor let your attachment be to inaction. Thank you.
Where the mind is without fear, by Rabindranath Tagore. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. This is my prayer to thee, my Lord. Strike at the root of penury in my heart. Give me the strength lightly to bear my joys and sorrows. Give me the strength to make my love fruitful in service. Give me the strength never to disown the poor or bend my knees before insolent might. Give me the strength to raise my mind high above daily trifles. And give me the strength to surrender my strength to thy will with love. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd request the dignitaries to please light the lamp. I shall now introduce Professor Aseem Prakash, who will be introducing this 21st lecture. Um, Professor Aseem Prakash is currently the chairperson at the School of Governance and Public Policy at TIS, Hyderabad. He's done his doctorate from JNU, and he had long stint as a John Fell Fellow at the University of Oxford. He kind of set up the entire School of Public Policy at TIS, and being the very modest person that he is, he's like, no, don't say all this. I've had a long personal association with him, and I've been very, very lucky that even though I was never formally taught by him, he guided me through my entire journey to Oxford and through my PhD, and I am much that I am today because of him. He'll be introducing today's lecture series, so over to him.
Thank you so much, Shyam, for this kind introduction. Good evening, all of you. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce three illustrious gentlemen of our century. So I'll start with Mr. D.S. Borker first, whose memory this lecture has been instituted. The D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture Series on My Vision of India 2047 AD. He was a civil servant, and the lecture was started and was initiated in the year 1999. The lecture is held every year in the memory of him, able civil servant and a public sector administrator, on August 24 every year at India International Center. DSB or Nath, to friends, civil servant, public sector administrator, strong advocate of physical education for India, proponent of the idea of play streets in Indian cities, a secular democrat, always ready to stand up for the poor and the weak, and above all, a man known for his human approach and simplicity. Born in Bombay on 17th August 1911, he had his early education in Bombay and went to England for his further studies. Upon India's independence, DSB joined as the private secretary to Mr. N.V. Gadgil, a member of Jawaharlal Nehru's first Union cabinet, and worked with great dedication and sincerity of purpose. There is an incident pertaining to the post-partition period when Delhi was still in the throes of communal riots, which is recorded by N.V. Gadgil in his memoir, that should be mentioned here. DSB saved the life of Hussain Imam, the chairperson Council of States, from desperate mobs and personally escorted him to the Safdarjung airport and put him on the plane to Patna. This was 8th September 1947. This particular initiative was at a grave risk to his own life. Such was his commitment and values to which he held dear. Last month, in this very hall of IIC, the book by the legendary iconic civil servant Mr. M.N. Butch, the titled An India Reimagined, Governance and Administration in the World's Largest Democracy, was released by former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. In the book, Mahesh Butch asked, "How does the voice of conscience operate?" He then answers, "A very good example would be that of late Kaka Saheb, that is N.V. Gadgil. He was the Minister for Works and Housing at the centre. He was contemporary and close colleague of Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, and he was austere, hardworking and honest. His private secretary was another outstanding civil servant called D.S. Borker. On a visit to Bombay, Kaka Sahab, Gadgil decided to inspect some of the CPWD works. In those days, perhaps, the highest ranking CPWD officer in Bombay was an executive engineer, and he accompanied the minister during the inspection tour. At lunchtime, he invited the minister to eat with him at home. After the meal, when Kaka Sahab and Borker Sahab departed in the car, the minister told his secretary that inquiry should be held against the engineer to ascertain how he was able to feed the minister in silver thalis and whether the engineer was honest or not. Borker Sahab turned to the minister and asked whether he had read what was inscribed on the thalis. He told him that the thalis were shown to be the property of Mafatlal Group's guest house and had been borrowed by the engineer because he did not have utensils of a quality in which he felt he should feed the visiting dignitary. Kaka Sahab immediately ordered the driver to return to the engineer's residence. The gentleman was taken aback at the minister's return, but Kaka Sahab told him that he had come to apologize for having an unjustified thought in his mind about the integrity of the engineer. Such was the conscience of the man who refused to harbor an evil thought about his subordinate on account of a pure conjecture. That was the kind of political and civil leadership which India was governed just after independence. What a long way we have come away from that today. Also of particular relevance to India of today's speaker, Professor Shyam Menon, who was the founding Vice Chancellor of Ambedkar University, Delhi, is the fact that DSB came close to Baba Saheb Ambedkar from the year 1947 to 56, a period and that when Baba Saheb passed away, and his wife, Dr. Savita Ambedkar, was a regular visitor to the Borker home. DSB had varied interests in life, particularly physical education. In 1940, George Allen and Unwin, London, published his book Physical Education for India. The book is kept in the rare section of the Bodleian Library of University of Oxford, where it has been sourced by the family. In the book, he fervently appealed for creating a fitter nation. Through this book and articles in leading newspapers, he also advocated the innovative idea of play streets, by which certain streets during specific hours of the day were to be closed down for vehicular traffic so as to enable children to play on thoroughfares, an experiment which was tried with success in some cities of United Kingdom. The scheme mentioned in Borker's book was appreciated through the editorial columns of the Times of India of May 7, 1940. His contribution brought him honor and recognition. He was India's first delegate to the World Congress of Physical Education held in Stockholm in November 1939 and received the Ling Gold Medal from the King of Sweden. D.S. Borker had worked on Planning Commission's Committee on Plan Projects as well as in public sector organizations like Hindustan Steel, State Trading Corporation, Fertilizer Corporation and Engineers India. A versatile personality indeed. The Borker family can legitimately feel proud of this accomplishment of DSB. I'll just say a bit about the idea behind this lecture. The idea behind this D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture Series on my vision of India 2047 AD is to strengthen our secular democratic values and traditions and encourage the process of thinking regarding the kind of India we want in 2047. 100 years after independence from colonialism. The series is unique in that it has consistently showcased ideas and forward-looking agendas, often contrarian ideas and agendas across a remarkable spectrum. Debate, after all, is an intrinsic and invaluable part of democratic and secular India. D.S. Borker's two sons, Shekhar and Suhas, had initiated this lecture series in the year 1999. Shekhar passed away in January 2015. This shall be the fourth time the lecture is being held without Shekhar. Speaking on the 25th Memorial Day of DSB, while delivering the 6th DSB lecture in 2004, K.R. Narayan, former President of India, said, Shri Borker was a remarkable public servant. Very few public servants have such lectures instituted in their names in Delhi. This is a tribute to his ideas, to his identity with the larger causes of India, and to his great intellect and sympathy for the people and their problems. I want to pay a tribute to this remarkable public servant who had made an important impact on this somewhat skeptical capital, which is Delhi, and this impact is lasting impact. Now we come to this year lecture to be delivered today by Professor Shyam Menon and chaired by Professor Ashis Nandy. As all of us know, both of them are very accomplished and well-known intellectuals, men of ideas, vision. Again, it's an honor to introduce. I'll first introduce the chair, Professor Ashis Nandy. He's a political psychologist, a sociologist, and a futurist. Presently, he's an honorary fellow at the Center for Study of Developing Societies, Delhi, and formerly he was the director of the same institute. The institute itself has a legacy and history of pushing up alternate agendas for political and social development. Professor Nandy has been a fellow Woodrow Wilson Center, Washington, fellow Institute of Advanced Studies at Berlin, Nantes, and Edinburgh, UNESCO Professor in European Studies, University of Trier, Regent Fellow, University of California, Los Angeles, ICCR National Fellow, Open Society Fellow, Central European University, Budapest. It's remarkable that he has written more than 20 books and 120 papers. I will be happy if I'm able to accomplish even 20% of it, forget 50%. Among his well-known books are Alternative Sciences, The Intimate Enemy, The Traditions, Tyranny and Utopias, The Tao of Cricket, The Illegitimacy of Nationalism, The Savage Freud and other essays, On Possible and Retrieval Selves, Regimes and Narcissisms, Regimes of Despair. They're all published by Oxford University Press. He has been awarded numerous honors. The awards includes Grand Prize of the Fukuoka Asian Culture Prizes, Sri Narayan Guru Samiti Damodaran Award for Lifetime Achievement, and in 2019 the Hans Killian Prize endowed with 80,000 euros in Germany in recognition of his lifetime contribution to bridging diverse fields of social and cultural scientific research with a creative and interdisciplinary approach. Listed among top 100 public intellectuals by the Fortune magazine. It's an honor, sir, to read out this. Welcome to this Borker Memorial Lecture. Professor Shyam Menon, who will be delivering this edition of the lecture, is a man of vision, and all of us, at least our generation, will know him as establishing one of the finest university which this country has received, the Dr. Ambedkar University. He was the founding Vice Chancellor of the Ambedkar University. At Ambedkar University, he set up new benchmark in higher education in the country with an interdisciplinary approach and putting in place cutting-edge pedagogy. Earlier, since 1994, Shyam Menon was professor at the Central Institute of Education, University of Delhi, an institution to which he returned after his term as VC of Ambedkar was over. At Delhi University, he had also been Dean, Faculty of Education and the Proctor of the University. He had earlier been Director, School of Education, Indira Gandhi National Open University, and a professor at the Central Institute of Educational Technology, NCRT. He had also taught at the MS University, Baroda for several years. Professor Menon studied at the University of Kerala and at MS University of Baroda. He was later at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a Fulbright Fellow. His doctoral work was in the area of curriculum and cognition, and his postdoctoral research was in higher education. Much of his work has been in the curriculum studies, higher education and teacher education. He edited the journal Perspectives in Education for many years. He is at present on the International Advisory Board of Comparative Education, Teaching Education in Asia Pacific, Journal of Education. He is currently on the task force on access and equity in higher education constituted by International Association of University. It's befitting for Mr. Borker it's befitting for what I mean to say, that it's befitting for the career of some illustrious civil servant that somebody like Professor Shyam Menon giving this year's lecture. Welcome to you, sir. With these words, I invite you to deliver the lecture. Thank you so much.
Professor Ashis Nandy, Professor Aseem Prakash, Mr. Suhas Borker, the trustees of the D.R. Borker Memorial Foundation, the Borker family, members of the IIC, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm so happy to find many of my students here. So this lecture is particularly meant for younger people because the year we are talking about is something where I think you guys are more stake in than I have. Let me first of all express my gratitude to Mr. Suhas Borker for inviting me to deliver the 21st D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture. I am also grateful to Professor Ashis Nandy for helping me negotiate with my initial reluctance to accept the invitation. I'll explain why this reluctance in a minute. I begin by paying homage to the late Mr. D.S. Borker, distinguished civil servant whose life and work had been inspired by the spirit of national movement and the ideals on which the Republic of India was founded. My talk has 5 parts. The part 1 explains my initial reluctance to accept the invitation to deliver this lecture and my despondency having agreed to deliver it. Part 2 is about how I understand the term vision. Part 3 is about where, according to me, India is headed in the next few decades. Part 4 is a brief exposition on education, because that's my area of practice. And part 5 is a brief conclusion. I'm struck by the significance of the fixed theme of this lecture series, My Vision of India 2047 AD. We are often bewildered by the apparent caprice and unpredictability of contemporary developments, local, national, regional, and global, that we encounter in shorter spans of time, day to day, or in these days of Twitter, almost minute to minute. In the process of making sense of some of these short time frame developments, sometimes we lose sight of the larger perspective, a longer time frame. It is therefore useful to have occasions like this to step aside from short-term thinking and look far and look deep. The year 2047 is symbolic for us. It takes a full century, one would think, to build the nation we had promised ourselves in 1947, when we had redeemed, not wholly or in full measure, as Nehru had reminded us, the pledge we had made to destiny during our tryst with it long years ago. 100 years hence, we expect that we will have redeemed it fully and in wholly and full measure, and perhaps even managed to do something more. I congratulate the D.S. Borker Memorial Foundation to have thought up this constant theme. Thinking along this theme enables us to declutter our minds of short-term anxieties and hopes and look at our future in a larger time perspective, longer time perspective. However, as we get nearer to the year 2047, our short-term anxieties take the better of our long-term hopes. For we begin to fear whether at all we will have the time or the opportunity to redeem our pledge. On the other hand, we begin to feel apprehensive that somewhere along the way, during these past 7 decades, the pledge we had made has somehow got faded in our collective consciousness. And perhaps we are now trying to renegotiate with destiny for another tryst. Taking a page out of the Brexit lexicon, I would suspect we must be negotiating a new deal, or perhaps no deal with destiny. My initial reluctance to accept the invitation to deliver this lecture today had something to do with the unsettled feeling I had been left with after May 2019. I realized that a whole set of premises underlying my understanding of contemporary realities needed to be re-examined. That made any exercise of envisioning our future deeply wrought with problems. Even so, at that time, I didn't quite realize that we were standing on literally quicksand. Who would have thought, for instance, that between when the lecture was announced and today, the political map of India would be redrawn? This essentially means that we cannot take anything for granted, anything at all for granted, while engaging with our hopes and fears about the future. The happenings during this month, August 2019, constituted some kind of surrealistic experience, which made it clear to me that any kind of envisioning of 30 years into the future was most hazardous. I was petrified, wondering what kind of trap I had fallen myself into. Having agreed to share with all of you in a public platform my vision of 2047. In that moment of total despondency, the following words that I had been familiar with ever since my student days came back to me almost like an epiphany. I quote, "All that is solid melts into air. All that is sacred is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." Unquote. These lines were part of what may perhaps be the most read of vision statements ever written, Manifesto of the Communist Party. Although it was published in February 1848, Marx and Engels had written this document towards the end of 1847. That means these lines were written exactly 200 years prior to the year we are here this evening to envision. Although these words were about the consequences of constantly revolutionizing modes and instruments of production in the epoch of the bourgeoisie and the consequent uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, I found these words resonate with my own unsettledness, witnessing as I was the several disruptions during the recent months. I needed to be reminded that nothing that we had gotten used to through these past 7 decades could any longer be taken as given. Having said that, even when something has been envisioned so persuasively by two of the most brilliant minds of the 19th century, it still can go terribly wrong. The collapse of capitalism under its own weight, the emergence of a classless society, and the withering away of the state, all these seem to be much farther today than it might have appeared to Marx and Engels in the middle of the 19th century. So here at last I found my caveat. If my vision of India 2047 were actually to be proved completely off the mark, then I can at least console myself that I was in the august company of two very distinguished bearded men. Now my part 2. In an article that came published in Calvert Journal in December 2017, Sasha Raspopina reported the unearthing of several time capsules in Russia and some of the other former Soviet republics. These time capsules containing messages written mostly by the local committees of the Communist Party were buried in 1967 in different parts of the Soviet Union as part of the celebrations marking 50 years of revolution, with the expectation that these would be unearthed in 2017 when the citizens of the USSR would be engaged in glorious celebrations of the centenary of the revolution. These messages make very interesting reading today. Some of them are like straight out of science fiction. Some others are full of polemics. Some express hope for peace. I will read out to you a message hoping for peace that one of the time capsules contained. And I quote, "You have never had to chant," this addressing the future generation, "you have never had to chant, 'Shame on the Israeli aggressors.' You have never had to protest the criminal war in Vietnam. Read news about provocations in revolutionary Cuba. How far away these events are from you, young crowd of 2017? We are sure that you have justified the trust your heroic predecessors have invested in you, that you have created a new world." Unquote. It's a sad irony that this particular message comes from Ukraine of 1967, which even today is a war zone. I brought this up essentially to highlight the point that we must not take this whole exercise of envisioning too seriously. If we do, that will be a bit childish. Whether we like it or not, we tend sometimes to extrapolate past and present to an unknown future, which does not take into consideration the unexpected disruptions and the complexities that they unleash, which might alter drastically our course ahead. Having said that, I would argue that envisioning as an exercise is of intrinsic importance. It may or may not give us a peek into our likely future, leave alone usher us into a desired future, but it surely gives our present a perspective, a sense of purpose, a sense of mobilizing solidarity around a shared goal. That's perhaps what they were doing with those time capsules in 1967. Let me now try and clarify what I understand as vision. I would like to locate the category vision in an ecosystem constituted of other related categories, namely dream, aspiration, hope, reasonable expectation, apprehension, fear, and despair. Dreams, aspirations, and hopes in their undiluted form lead to imaginations of utopia. On the other end of the spectrum, apprehensions, fears, and despair lead to imaginations of dystopia. In between these extremes is located the gray area of reasonable expectation. When we lean too much towards hope, or for that matter to fear, we are making projections, either in the positive direction or in the negative, in which inheres an assumption that there will be no major historical disruption. However, we know only too well, and that we should know in the past few months, that history is full of disruptions, whose explanations are all too often arrived at only ex post facto. To me, vision is a combination of dreams, aspirations, and hope, tempered with reasonable expectation. Having taken into account the apprehensions and fears, I would like to see vision as a resultant positive force incorporating and containing within it the pulls in both these directions. When vision is articulated through a collective historical process and a whole society or a nation begins to consider that they have a collective stake in realizing it, it assumes the stature of an important source of inspiration, motivation, and energy to act towards a shared goal, even if it is at times at the cost of considerable personal sacrifice. Underlying a shared vision is enormous amount of groundwork already done historically. In that sense, a vision is grounded on historical antecedents and mobilizations that have already been accomplished, often through a painful and protracted process. Yet, vision stretches beyond what objective circumstances and historical antecedents would prepare ground for. It is a force that galvanizes people, a community, a society, or a whole nation to act beyond themselves and their limited historical roles. The realization of a vision is usually more than its imagination. Let's now examine one extreme possibility that is not very uncommon in history. When we consider that our hopes for the future are incongruent with the reasonable expectations we draw from empirical reality, that the course of contemporary events presents, and we feel intensely helpless to influence in any manner the course of events, one tends to take refuge in another exercise that I did not include in the hope-fear continuum I mentioned a little earlier. This exercise is prayer. Prayer stands outside the hope-fear continuum. Prayer to me is a complex synthesis of hope and fear. When reasonable expectation leans more towards our apprehensions than our hope, we tend to divert our energy to appealing for the intervention of forces that are beyond our comprehension. When one finds oneself in total despair and immersed completely in despondency, one wishes intensely for things to somehow, in ways which we don't completely understand, fall in place and put us back on the path of our shared vision. It is when reason provides little support for hope, that's often when we resort to prayer. Yet, prayer is vision in its purest form, and it holds the potential of invoking powerfully people, communities, and societies much more effectively than any prosaic and well-reasoned out vision statement can. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. had demonstrated to us convincingly the power of prayer as a powerful force of political mobilization. Let me therefore clarify that under the broad rubric of vision, I shall talk this evening about my hopes, my fears, as well as about what appears to me as reasonable expectations. I will raise those issues, concerns, and questions related to our society and our polity, which I think are critical in the next few decades. This by no means is exhaustive. I do not have the expertise to offer full explanations or answers to these. All the same, I think it is important for us to reiterate our cognition of these issues. I will raise these as open-ended questions in my capacity as a citizen. Inviting all of us to ponder over these, I shall at times resort to prayer, particularly on such matters where I do not with any clarity see a course of resolution. I will also talk briefly about education, which is my area of practice, and in so doing, focus on two key issues that I consider critical in understanding education in India 3 decades into future. Education, as I shall argue, is a consequence of, or a corollary to, and not cause, of the social and political trajectory that we are likely to traverse through. What would be the idea of India, or rather Bharat, in 2047? And what by then would have happened to Hindustan, Hamara Hindustan, which is Sare Jahan se acha? What would be the character of our constitution? Would the republic continue to be socialist, secular, and democratic? Would justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity be still its guiding principles? What would be the nature of the Indian state and the polity come 2047? What would be the state of federalism in India? What would be the kind of geopolitical games in South Asia and elsewhere that the big boys would be playing? And I would imagine that India by 2047 might be one of them. How would that transform, or being part of the big boys, transform us as a nation and a society? I do not wish to indulge in any crystal ball gazing on this matter. There is undoubtedly considerable fragility in the situation, and any eventuality is possible. However, it serves no purpose speculating on this here. I will leave these questions for all of us to ponder about. I'll turn to inequality. India is one of the most unequal societies in the world today. It is truly an incredible India, incredibly unequal. Unlike in many other societies, inequalities in our society between social groups and between men and women have an entire cosmology and the backing of religious doctrines. That's perhaps the reason why Brahminism and patriarchy and majoritarian supremacist ideologies hiding behind these seem to strike back with renewed vigor, vitality, and determination every time we begin to believe that we have seen the last of them. As we enter the third decade of the 21st century, we find ideologies supporting caste system, male domination, and majoritarian supremacy alive and kicking, finding new forms of dominance, hegemony, and oppression. Having said that, I'm hopeful about the oppressed castes and tribes as well as minorities strategically mobilizing themselves into effective political formations that will have a pan-Indian presence and considerable political and electoral clout. I also see very clear indication that in spite of the resurgence of patriarchy in certain quarters, women, particularly urban women across classes, are going to be increasingly assertive about their rights, largely thanks to their impressively increasing participation in education and employment. However, I fear that for rural women, there is a long road ahead of struggle and resistance from within oppressive structures. I would hope that the rigid rules of endogamy that insulates jatis, castes, and religious communities would loosen. At the moment, less than 5% of all marriages are outside caste. This is changing in metropolises and will eventually spread to small towns as well. The tension between progressiveness and revivalism will continue. The next few decades will see more struggles, particularly on the part of women. I see honor killing as the last act of desperation by patriarchy on the emergence of a new womanhood that it finds difficult to reconcile with. I dream of 2047 where there is no more honor killing. I see a reasonable possibility of a major shift in the asymmetry in the distribution of labor within domestic spaces between women and men, particularly in urban India. I also see possibility of a larger proportion of urban women choosing not to get married, particularly through the arranged marriage route, because the heavy price that marriage and extended family extract from them is no longer acceptable. In the first few decades after independence, there used to be a certain reticence bordering on mild embarrassment about flaunting wealth. It is no longer the case for the past about 2 decades. Inequality is not any longer something to be embarrassed about. P. Sainath had observed from this very platform 3 years ago that India now seems to be celebrating its inequality. The last 2 decades have seen an unprecedented, assertive, and aggressive flaunting of wealth. The 27-story tower home on the Altamount Road, Kambala Hill in Mumbai, that stands tall as a phallic symbol, thumbing its nose at the city squalor, is the ultimate act of celebration of India's modern-day inequality. On the other hand, the building is an awe-inspiring, almost quasi-religious symbol, something like a giant totem head, serving as an immoral compass for the highly motivated and upbeat aspirational India. My fear, supported by reasonable expectation, is that in the next 2 or 3 decades, it will be difficult to reverse this trend of increasing inequality. By 2047, it's probable that inequality will have found new manifestations. Let me add a parenthetical note here. The aspirational India is largely drawn from the upper caste. Brahmins, who constitute 5%, and Baniyas, 2% of the population, dominate big business and the professions. In the case of corporate sector, the picture is quite stark. A study by D. Ajit, Han Donker, and Ravi Saxena, published in 2012 in the Economic and Political Weekly, examining the caste diversity in corporate boards of the top 1,000 Indian companies, reveals that Brahmins occupy 44.6% of the positions on corporate boards and the Baniyas 46%. That's between them, it's more than 90%. There is clearly a perfect alignment between caste and capital, and it appears that private capital is the last bastion of upper caste supremacy. If the deeply entrenched caste system has eventually to be rooted out, some of the final battles will have to be fought in the domain of the private capital. It is about time that the OBC, Dalits, and Adivasis begin to look beyond jobs in the government, a space which in any case is shrinking, and make strategic and planned inroads into the world of private capital. The continuing trend of widening inequality clearly indicates that we may not have a singularity that characterizes our future. On the other hand, we may have multiple futures and multiple trajectories that lead us there. Indian society is in fact like a multi-headed dragon. Its heads are racing towards various alternative future possibilities. The future of the big capitalists and that of the urban professional middle class may have some alignment with each other. They seem to be heading in fairly predictable directions. Their fortunes and those of the class that run the Indian state seem to be well integrated. By 2047, they will, in all likelihood, be located in insular and protected residential communities and work environments that will expose them less and less to others who do not belong there. This is part of what Arundhati Roy calls the great secession of the rich and the middle class from the rest of India, ejecting themselves into the outer space. But the bulk of the Indian population, to the tune of about 80%, who has only an indirect association with the organized or formal sectors of the economy, will perhaps have pretty much uncertain futures. In the next about 30 years, this huge chunk of the Indian population may have to traverse through complex and unpredictable trajectories, struggling all the way. In the case of some of them, for some kind of upward mobility, and for others, just to keep themselves afloat. There are, of course, high internal differentiations within this demographic bulk of 80%. There is likely to be about 20% on the top of this chunk of the population who are made to see possibilities of entry into the charmed inner space of the society and the economy. They are the ones who hover around the core economy, scaffold it from outside, and in some sense even give legitimacy to it. The bottom 20%, on the other hand, will receive the brunt of the economic distress, ecological disasters, joblessness, displacement, homelessness, and even disenfranchisement to a degree greater in intensity than perhaps what they experience at present. The middle 40% is critical. They, along with the 20% just above them, are the ones who will keep the republic going. The 60% of the population are the ones who queue up at polling booths and elect popular governments, and they are the primary target of all the mainstream Indian news channels, fake news, and other kinds of propaganda. Most of our mainstream media, particularly our news channels, have begun to resemble Roman circuses, with millions of viewers on the virtual plane baying for blood and screaming thumbs down. I would suspect that the viewership of the World Wrestling Federation, WWF channel, may have gone down drastically in India after the mainstream media started airing these gladiator fights. The economists warn us that growth is not likely to generate new jobs. On the other hand, it is quite possible that employment in the organized sectors will stagnate, if not shrink. This will particularly be exacerbated in the coming decades through the advent of automation and artificial intelligence. Many jobs are likely to disappear, and the workforce will have to reinvent itself every few years by acquiring new skills to just about survive in the job market. This is going to be extremely difficult for people, not merely because of the economic consequences of joblessness, but also because the intense emotional stress due to uncertainty and the constant struggle to reinvent oneself. Yuval Noah Harari, in his book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, wonders, and I quote, whether the average human will have the emotional stamina necessary for a life of such endless upheavals, unquote. Harari predicts that by 2050, a useless class might emerge not merely because of an absolute lack of jobs or lack of relevant education, but also because insufficient mental stamina. It appears that among the jobs that are going to stay protected would be those of psychotherapists, psychiatrists, and other kinds of mental health professionals. The useless class, which thus falls into the abyss of being permanently unemployed and unemployable, is rendered irrelevant by the organized economy because it holds no utility except minimally as marginal consumers. This contrasts with the working class in an earlier epoch, which was susceptible to being exploited. Here, Harari points to an apparent fall of the marginal class from being exploited to being irrelevant. The logical extension of the scenario, according to Harari, is the dystopia where the useless class is eventually pushed into the margins and left to poverty, malnutrition, disease, and increased vulnerability to natural calamity, while the rich and the powerful soar beyond hitherto unimaginable frontiers of superhuman glory, immortality, and eternal youth, thanks largely to breakthroughs in bioengineering, the fruits of which only they can afford. My sense, however, is that this may not quite work the way Harari predicts in societies like India. Even today, the formal sectors of the economy employs only less than 10% of India's workforce. When the job market shrinks further, in the decades to come, the class of people who would get left out may constitute too large a segment of the population to be just ignored and wished away. This class will surely evolve ingenious ways of making their voices heard, whatever might be the nature of polity in India at that point in time. Now let me come to another of my major apprehensions. In the next decade or so, we are likely to witness a free run for those who want to maximize their profits through an unprecedented level of exploitation of natural resources. The legal regulatory frameworks are likely to be loosened through legislative and administrative actions, ostensibly in the interest of an accelerated economic growth. For instance, we already see that the requirement of environmental impact assessments is often diluted in the name of ease to do business. We find that the reports of committees appointed by the government on environmental protection with much fanfare, such as the Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel chaired by Madhav Gadgil and that of the subsequent Kasturirangan Committee, eliciting no serious policy response for reasons of political expediency. The scientific community, by and large, seems to be looking the other way. The US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change mitigation has undermined possibilities of any effective global response to climate change, at least for the present. Given all this, what will be the immediate, intermediate, and long-term consequences of development at the cost of environment? Come 2047, what will be the state of our forests, our mountains, our rivers, our water bodies, our coastal areas, and the people whose lives have for centuries been intricately intertwined with these? The ruling elite needs an effective device to divert people's attention from real existential problems of extreme inequality and environmental injustice. The resurgence of hypernationalism and the politics of hate and othering constitute this highly potent tool. what would be the fate of the politics of hatred? Does hatred have a natural life cycle that lives itself out, much like a viral infection? I would like to believe that it has a limited shelf life, but I have fears lurking about that it may not be that way. The virus might form cysts that remain in the inner recesses of collective consciousness, and whenever it is presented with the right conditions, it emerges out of the cysts for living out another full life cycle. N. Ram had the following to say while delivering the 16th D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture just 3 months after the May 2014 election results. I quote, "At moments like the present," and this was August 2014, "at moments like the present, the apparent absence of capabilities within the political and constitutional system to keep religious majoritarianism at bay dispirits those who believe in secular democracy and modern civil society. But surely it won't do to accept any assessment or conclusion that suggests the inevitability of the triumph of an authoritarian majoritarianism over the progressive values of our freedom struggle, values that are embedded in our democratic and secular constitution. I would like to think that given the strengths of India's composite culture, its civilizational reserves, the wisdom of ordinary folk, the process being described above cannot be long-lasting. It is certainly not irreversible." Unquote. I would really want to believe that N. Ram would have reaffirmed this view if he were to deliver this lecture today. That there is nuclear capability among some countries in this region makes the politics of hate and the increase in hyper-nationalistic fervor in South Asia even more dangerous. The recent utterances in the subcontinent about resorting to nuclear options if necessary, and the apparent rethinking about no first use, may all well be part of an elaborate strategic posturing prior to a protracted process of diplomacy and politics. But if a fortuitous sequence of events pushes us into hitherto uncharted territories, one shudders to think of what that could lead to. As Harari says, one must never underestimate human stupidity. The wounds of critical historical events like partition need to be allowed to heal once and forever. Mr. Rajmohan Gandhi, delivering the 14th D.S. Borker Memorial Lecture, said, and I quote, "How can Delhi and Lahore and India and Pakistan find more visible ways of healing the wounds of 1947 and later wounds as well? Let me voice the hope that one day, through the toil and initiative of the bold and the forward-looking, a fine garden will emerge in Punjab, in Indian Punjab or Pakistani Punjab, or along their common border, a garden where every leaf and every flower would recall someone who perished in 1947's fires of revenge. Something like this should be done, for unhealed wounds have the power to produce fresh injuries." Unquote. Many of us here are aware that Professor Ashis Nandy and a large team of colleagues, drawn from various disciplinary backgrounds, conducted extensive documentation of testimonies by victims of partition. This was an attempt not just to document the madness and violence of those times, but more to create an archive based on which to work on the history of humanity, friendship, and compassion. This work is an invaluable resource, a treasure. Several conferences and meetings have been held on this theme, yet there is need for something more intense and comprehensive to be carried out. The monumental documentation of Professor Nandy and his team should be a starting point for what may well be a long and protracted process of reconciliation and forgiveness involving all the partition-affected people of the subcontinent. This is where I would like to offer a prayer. I would pray earnestly that well prior to 2047, we will have brought this sad and the most troubled, traumatic chapter of our history to a closure. Now I come to my part 4. I am a practicing educator and I have my dreams, hopes, and reasonable expectations about education in India in 2047. However, I would not like to go into questions that normally figure in any envisioning process about education. That is, about quantitative expansion, the quality of transaction, the extent of spread of public and private institutions, the standing of Indian institutions in the global arena, the nature of research, the role of new technology that might revolutionize teaching learning processes, and so on. All these are important, but this will need another exclusive talk altogether. What I will focus here this evening are on just two aspects of education that in some sense are linked with the issues that I have raised earlier in my talk. The first of these is about the primary social function of institutionalized education as a whole. In a highly stratified society like ours, with wide inequalities, institutionalized education seems to serve mainly one social function, that is, sorting and selecting. I would like to examine how far this is true of education in India today, and what is the likely trend in 30 years. The second aspect of education that I would like to touch upon this evening is about thought control. The state, particularly when it is transiting through a phase of diffidence and insecurity, resort to exerting control over institutions of education, particularly universities. I would like to examine how this phenomenon would act out in the next few decades and what its possible consequences might be. First, sorting and selecting. The architecture of our education system mirrors the terrain of our society. The institutional differentiations reflect class differentiations. I went to school in a district town in Kerala in the 1960s. Children like me, whose families could afford to send them to school, went to government schools or government-aided schools, all affiliated to the state board. There were no private fee-charging schools at that time in my district, and perhaps in the entire state of Kerala. The real social distinction was between those who went to school and those who did not. The fault lines of social stratification ran along the boundary walls of the schools. Today, in the same district, there are hundreds of private English medium schools affiliated to the CBSE, and a few of them to other elite boards. Many government-aided schools are opening up fee-charging private English medium entities within their own campuses. The government schools affiliated to the state board still function with very few students attending them, largely those from the margins. Interestingly, many of these children are Bengali origin children or people from Assam and Bihar and so on, because there is a lot of migrant labor in Kerala. So government schools are catering to non-Malayali children more than Malayali children. It's very interesting. But they are all learning Malayalam, by the way. The last 2 decades have seen a massive exodus of children coming from upwardly mobile, lower middle class and working class families who have migrated from government schools to private schools. The middle class and the wannabe middle class have abdicated the public school system, more or less just like they have abdicated the public health system. With the exit of the middle class, the possibility of negotiating quality in these public systems, health as well as education, has got drastically undermined. Neither private nor public education is any longer a homogeneous category. There are as many differentiations within each as there are social strata. Schools are becoming internally more homogeneous though, the cultural ethos within them getting less diverse. There are institutions practically exclusive to communities, castes, and religions. It is sad that today, larger number of children graduate out of school without ever experiencing the joys of diversity. The question no longer is who goes to school, but who goes to which kind of school. No matter what trajectory of schooling they go through, everybody seems to accept the system for its meritocracy and carries the impression that there is equality of opportunity. There is a sense of fair chance for everybody to compete in the gatekeeping rituals, the entrance examinations, and the aptitude tests at the end of class 12, around which the entire school system and its auxiliary system, that is the coaching industry, revolves. Transacting a content-loaded curriculum that trains young people through rote learning for assembly lines and which actively discourages critical thinking, originality, and creativity. These gatekeeping rituals give the impression of a fair opportunity to make it to elite, higher education institutions, high salaried jobs, and a passport to privilege. If young people don't make it, and a vast majority don't, they wouldn't blame the system, they blame themselves. Thus, the education system mediates the otherwise unacceptable levels of inequalities. Education is a lubricant. It's a lubricant that smoothens the grinding edges of class frontiers. I'm afraid that this trend is not likely to change in the next 3 decades. So long as inequalities in society remain, so will the sorting and selecting function of school through its diverse institutional trajectories. My limited hope is that the gatekeeping rituals at the end of class 12 may perhaps change with time for the better. And with that, we may get a much needed release from the clutches of the culture of rote learning and the coaching industry. However, the middle class abdication of public school systems will eventually spread to public higher education systems as well. We already see this trend in public higher education institutions at the district and sub-district levels, and even at the state levels. This might spread in the next couple of decades even to prestigious public universities in the metropolises. This exodus will be abetted by the increasing trend of grossly inadequate public expenditure on higher education, particularly the liberal education programs. The middle class exodus from the public education also arises from problematic notions of what is good education. This is, of course, another debate, and I will reserve it for a future occasion. At the other end of the continuum, there is some hope. It's clear that the poor and the marginalized will become more discerning and demanding as regards what they consider as quality of public schooling, as well as other public services like health. The trend in Delhi of public schooling and public health gaining prominence as electoral issues will become a national phenomenon soon. While emotive issues like nationalism may continue to dominate national elections, those like education and health will become critical issues based on which state and local governments will be elected. I'll go to the next aspect of education which I wanted to talk about, thought control. Historically, in every society, there have been, in one form or the other, a free flow of thoughts and ideas from scholars to scholars, from teachers to seekers, and from experienced practitioners to the aspiring ones. Societies have always tried and created institutional structures like universities to contain this flow, and the state has, time and again, attempted to exert some amount of control over this flow. A confident and self-assured state would find university as a safety valve for the larger society. University contains within controlled conditions the implosions of dissent that often question the fundamentals of the existing order, and their fallouts seldom spill over the walls of the campuses to the larger society. These institutions, therefore, serve as crucibles for smelting new and inconvenient ideas, experimenting with them, and eventually containing them in the form of intellectual products like books, theses, and works of creativity. At the end of the day, what these institutions really do is to train young people to dissent and to demolish intellectually what they might otherwise attempt to do physically. The graduates of universities eventually fit by and large into social positions as solid citizens in spite of their deep uneasiness with society, and many of them continue to translate their disaffection into creative expressions within the contours of existing knowledge. Even the most radical of our universities have over the years produced more teachers, researchers, professionals, civil servants, journalists, and development workers than they have produced revolutionaries. A confident state knows the worth of university and the creative role of dissent that it discharges. It is always an insecure and diffident state that resorts to repression and ham-handed attempts at silencing free expression on campuses. Such repression only strengthens the flow of ideas. When there is a groundswell for ideas, there is no stopping it. When their free flow is blocked in formal institutional spaces, they will emerge in the form of 1,000 little springs all over the informal landscape. Anti-intellectualism has manifested in many societies in many instances in history. The most well-known in the recent history has been the large-scale burning of books and persecution of intellectuals in Nazi Germany. These were acts of desperation coming out of fear of ideas. These are counterproductive at the end of the day. I am hopeful that what appears to be an anti-intellectual phase in our society will blow over soon. There is a genuine fear that the social sciences are going to be under some kind of siege. There may be a serious shortage of funds, and the environment in public universities may become such that the best minds may not be attracted to them. This may result in some of them migrating overseas or opting to do freelance scholarly work. University-based scholarship may see a phase of relative decline, which I earnestly hope would be just for a brief period. The culture of scholarship and inquiry will find expression outside of formal institutions. The springs of original thinking, scholarship, and creativity will find their own ways of expression in various forms through diverse modes and channels. India is a civilizational society, and the intellectual and creative spirit of India shall never be thwarted beyond the brief interludes of relative darkness. Now I come to my conclusion. As I said in the beginning of my talk, we tend to pray when we find reason not supporting our hope. When our prayer is composed with utmost serenity, nesting within it the very essence of a powerful vision, it acquires the potency to mobilize the inner resources and energies of a whole nation to strive together in solidarity. When Tagore wrote his famous prayer sometime in 1900, which he called simply Prarthana in Bangla, he may have been totally immersed in sadness at the state India was in at that time. Some of his poems at that time, like Kenoche Achogoma Mukhopane, Why Do You Gaze at Me Thus, O Mother, written in the last years of the 19th century, reflects this state of deep sadness and despair. Tagore may have found no reasonable basis to expect at that time that India would someday attain freedom from its political subjugation. Abject poverty, obscurantism, sectarianism, and bigotry. He must have felt deeply and totally helpless. His poems, including his Prarthana, may have trickled out of his immense anguish. Tagore might not have realized at that time that he wrote his Prarthana, that it would survive a whole century and more, and would still contain the distilled essence of a new India's hopes and aspirations for the 21st century. I find no better way, like we began the day with the prayer, I find no better way of concluding my talk this evening than by reciting the same prayer, Tagore's Prarthana. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches his arm towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Thank you.
I've taken a lot of notes, but I promise you that I won't do what many people do, where the presidential address stretches longer than the actual lecture. I will make a few comments. This is an excellent presentation, and I don't feel that I have the right to give you a long lecture. But I will like to emphasize a few of the things he has said, and also might add one or two issues which follow from his presentation. First of all, I think India's case is not unique. Shyam Menon's pessimism comes from the fact that his the core of his interest lies in India. But if you look at the history of our times, say for instance, the history of last 75 years, you will find that this experience has been shared by a significant part of the world, which are called underdeveloped or poor. I mean, that is not fashionable to call it poor, you have to call it developing societies. Everybody knows what is what, but that's the way, that's the euphemism used. For instance, if you look at this history of last 75 years, you will find that every Asian country which has been included in the list of East Asian tigers turned out to be man-eaters. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand. In each case, the idea of quick development, the kind of development Western countries took 200 to 250 years to arrive at their present stage, was they thought they could short-circuit it. And in every case, the result was the same. So at least one Australian thinker called it developmental authoritarianism. It is the invariable fate of societies which try to develop very quickly. So be pleased if your development falters a little bit. Nothing much will be lost whether your developmental rate, growth rate, is 6.5 or 7.2. The slower rate is better for the health of the citizens. Because this is I could have given you another list of Latin American countries where this has happened, in Brazil and Argentina, for instance. This has been the record. Do not forget that even in South Asia, there was a society which was considered a welfare state. People talked about it. I have read papers which they said that Sri Lanka has opted out of the third world. It is a welfare state and it is a socially very creative state and has adequate momentum in its developmental profile. But that didn't please the Sri Lankans. They were impressed by and envious of Singapore. They wanted to make a Singapore out of Sri Lanka. And in the process, the kinds of conflict that broke out ultimately led to a civil war. And Sri Lanka has gone back 30 years. Nobody calls it now a welfare state, though it must be still retaining some vestige of its older self. So there is this danger. I agree. And it is obvious that India's fate is not going to be very different. Fortunately, I have made rough calculations about the longevity of regimes such as this. And it is very poor. The longest serving state of this kind was probably Argentina, under the Peronistas. That is because Peron was kind enough to die early. But between his wife and his disciples, they turned the state into a manageably benign state. Not very benign, it was authoritarian, all right, but a more benign form of authoritarianism, a paternalistic state, you can call it. But otherwise, their longevity is very poor. And invariably, when they fall, the traces of what had transpired just before the fall do not remain there very much. one of the states, I am now giving a different kind of example, is Soviet Union, which after 70 years of communist rule, when communism failed in 1989, Soviet Union returned to a state where not a trace of, forget communism, not even a trace of socialism went there. They have now, even now, have a more primitive form of capitalism than United States once had, and which they always criticized. So that's the fate of the states. But that is the most dramatic example, but I can give you many examples of that kind, that one of the reasons for that is this, that this kind of regimes always leaves its trace in the form of brutalization of a society. Nowadays, this kind of studies have become difficult, but I do want younger people to do something of that kind. My rough calculations show that in our newspapers, if you eliminate some of the pages like advertisements and sports and all, probably as much as more than 80% of the space is given to the coverage of violence, crime, and accidents. And nature of the crimes are also changing. There are many more crimes within the family. There are crimes where teenagers, there was a teenager who was given a death sentence. I do not know whether he was hanged or not in Calcutta. One chap called Dhananjay. He killed his parents. This is a lower middle class family, so they didn't have much wealth. But this teenager killed his parents and I think 3 siblings. 3 siblings. Why? Because he expected to inherit whatever little property they had. This is the kind of brutalization that is taking place in the society. Norms are collapsing, the society is imploding within itself. So this is one part of it. Second, Shyam has talked about the temporality or diversity of visions and evidently doesn't want to give it too much of importance. I do think that even if your visions are wrong, even if they are disproved, the very fact that you are generating different kinds of vision at least ensures that your vision has not become a single one. Now, India's vision is now known. It is increasingly becoming a monolithic vision. We want to be developed. We want to compete with the best in the world in the matter of development. We want to have a higher income, average income will do, whatever be the inequality, which is mentioned. And this vision has become predominant, so much so that to disagree with it is a sign of being anti-national. But it is a fact that as long as you can keep the vision plural, as long as you can have diversity of opinion, at least that very diversity ensures some degree of protection for different points of view, whether the government allows that or not. So that is that part of the story. Also, it is just not true that the visions that emerge from social sciences or humanities is somehow more fragile and more often likely to be disproved. Like the Soviet Union example he gave of time capsules. By the way, India also had a time capsule, and though they didn't reveal the full contents, it was available to, in India nothing remains secret very long. And I can tell you that time capsule is a lovely subject now, would be a lovely subject of a PhD dissertation. It's absolutely comical now, I know. And they thought they were trying to promote the right kind of views in India which will survive time. This was Professor Nurul Hassan's time. It is not, BJP is not the only culprit of having a monolithic India. There are other concepts of monolithic India too, had been, even in the Republic of JNU. And, so, I would like to point out that the vision of scientists have not been any better. Indeed, I will propose that the visions emanating from outside the sciences about science can also be sometimes more true than what the scientists themselves believe. In year 1900, there was a Paris Expo. And in that expo, they tried to find out the views of world's leading scientists on what will be the nature of science in the next 100 years, between 1900 and year 2000. So to give you some flavor of it, the highest speed human beings will attain. In response to this question, the highest speed came out to be 250 miles an hour, which speed record was broken by the year 1920s, early 30s. So forget the century. Scientists like Marconi, one of the discoverers of radio waves, himself felt the radio will never be a popular thing in human affairs. It will be too expensive for ordinary human beings to have the radio in their home. People like Thomas Alva Edison, who discovered the electric bulb, thought that it should be used only for public places because it is too expensive. It will be too expensive for ordinary people to have bulbs, electric bulbs at home. I mean, unbelievable. And the descriptions of a journey to the moon given by Jules Verne has turned out to be more true when human beings travel to the moon than any scientific description or vision of a journey to moon. Because that also was explored by people, that there are scientists, how the moon landing will take place and where they will. I mean, Jules Verne was more correct than any of them. So there is this part of the story. That is because in human creativity, there is always an element of disjunction. It is not a linear development of what exists. The future is not a linear projection of the present, which is the way we think of it. Future means a disjunction with the present, and therefore there is an element of creativity which allows even poets and musicians to have visions of the future which in the long run turn out to be more relevant than that of the most hard-headed scientist in the world. So there is this part of the story too. And I do hope that I am old, very old, but Shyam Menon is not. I hope he will find that the future will throw up its own challenges and own forms of resistance too. And what looks like a rather dark history and dark story of the present times will probably brought to an end by maybe even an accident, or maybe even a spontaneous movement, or that we cannot at the moment dream of. Maybe I leave it to this audience to think of for They have their visions of how that can be done. An American wheat was once asked, "What do you think of the future?" He said, "Why should I think of the future? What has the future done for me?" I hope we are in not that company. And we do believe that our visions are important. The vision of George Orwell of 1984 didn't turn into a reality. 1984 passed peacefully and nicely without a global authoritarian regime. But in that peaceful passage of time, there must have been a role played by 1984, the novel. Don't forget that part of the story. I wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shyam Menon, Professor Ashis Nandy. I think when Professor Shyam Menon spoke of multiple futures, that's what got absolutely brilliantly manifested in two speeches here. The first was moderately pessimist, the other was graciously positive, and that's what multiple futures are all about. And I think what Professor Shyam Menon was, the import of his talk for me was that what he's trying to tell us is that, yes, there is an interplay of markets and democracy on one hand. Yes, there is a interplay of some kind of an hyper-nationalism, idea of an hyper-nationalism and an idea of inclusive India on the other. And this, at the moment it appears to be, is throwing up a kind of inequality in the society, which will be fought by both the caste and gender in its own way. And that's what the but the one very critical message which I got from this thing is what you mentioned is that it's about the entitlements will be created in the market rather than the state. When you said the castes and the lower caste will look for a fresher or a greater entry into the market economy. So there's somewhere, and that's what, and the message which comes through that is there may be idea which can be imposed from top. It can of any kinds, whether it comes from the Republic of JNU or it comes from the majoritarian democracy, whatever one talks about. But the society evolves on its own pace, and that is what the multiple futures are all about. And when the society evolves, it resists any kind of imposition from the top. Yeah, that's what the import for me was. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And thank you so much, Professor Shyam Menon, once again. Thank you, Professor Nandy, for this brilliant evening. Have a good evening, all of you. Okay.